Hello! Welcome to Lesson 2 of the JavaScript and ACI video series. In the last video, we started setting up the environment that we'll be using in these lessons. In this lesson, we'll finish the environment setup and start writing the HTML we'll be using for our user interface, which begs the question, what will our user interface look like? So here's a sneak peek. It's nothing fancy, and a couple of the later sections aren't filled in yet down there at the bottom. But here's how the user will use this application. First, the user will start the app, hopefully by double-clicking on an icon somewhere. Once the page opens, the user will need to indicate in some way which API they want to connect to. In ACI, the controlling APIs are joined together into a cluster of 3, 5, 7, whatever, but they each continue to have their own management addresses. In my experience, so far, the easiest way for a user to indicate what API they want to connect to is to give them a list on the screen and let them pick one. And that's how we're going to do it. So after the user picks an API, they'll need to enter the username and password that they'll be using for the connection, and then they'll click on the sign in button. When the sign in button is clicked, the JavaScript code that the button kicks off will connect to the chosen API with the username and password that the user entered, and we'll get the session tokens necessary to do actions later that the user will be able to choose. For today, we'll focus on the first 3 steps and leave the connection for a later lesson. So, going back to the page, we'll put a title at the top, and we'll just use JavaScript for ACI user interface. Here is where the user will select a fabric, and in reality that's a single API. Here is where the user will enter their username and password for that API, along with the sign-in button to kick off the connection. These last 2 sections, like I said, will be where we can put buttons to start some actions we might want to do with that API. But first, I had intended to do everything with only Notepad and Chrome and nothing else. I still think that can be done, but it was just too painful as I got into it, especially when I know there's an easier way. So we're going to add to the environment that we set up back in lesson 1. Specifically, we're going to add jQuery and Bootstrap. So next I'm going to go through installing jQuery and Bootstrap. But first, I want to apologize for the audio. It'll get better as time goes along. But another thing I want to say is I'm not going to provide the files because what I think it would be best is for anybody who's going through this to actually type these things in themselves as they go along. You can pause the screen, you can skip to the end and pause the screen and type it in. You're going to learn more that way, at least I do, and so that's how I'm presenting it. Alright, so here's the folder that we created last time. I'm going to open it up, and it came up on the other screen. So let's make a list of what we want to do. To-do list. Alright, 1. We're going to, it's not really install, but download jQuery. 2. Download Bootstrap. 3. Make HTML file. Alright, so get that out. Download jQuery. We can just double click here and go here. Alright, so jQuery.com. And go to the download link, and we want the compressed production jQuery 351. So save link as, and we want it, where's desktop? There's desktop in our JFA files. We'll make a new folder and call it jQuery. Go in there and just put it there. Voila. There it is, right there. Now, we can make a new folder before we get Bootstrap. Bootstrap. And let's get that back here. And get Bootstrap. And we'll go to download. We will download, show in folder, oops, don't want to cut it, copy, and that was a bad thing to do, so I'll delete that. I will paste the Bootstrap, and I'm going to just rename it to Bootstrap to make it simpler. And inside of that it has its CSS and its JavaScript, and you really never have to look at it. Alright, so I thought that was our to-do list. Oh, it's down here. Looking at our to-do list, jQuery and Bootstrap are now there. So now we'll make the HTML file. And I'm going to try to stay true to my word, and we'll only use Notepad for this. Get rid of that. Alright, we'll new text document. It's not actually going to be text, but we'll call it jfa-user-interface.html. Are you sure you want to change it? Yes. Now we will open with Notepad. So the first thing we'll put in this HTML file is the opening HTML tag and the closing HTML tag. And the first thing we'll put is the opening head tag and the closing head tag, followed by the body tag and the closing body tag. In the head, we'll make a title, and we'll call this JFA User Interface title. So now we have a fully functioning HTML file which is blank. So let's put something into it. The first thing that we need to do is put in the jQuery scripts, and that's because Bootstrap depends on jQuery. So I'm gonna use my cheat sheet here. Here's how you do that. Script source. Oops, I'm putting it in the wrong place. I want it before the closing body tag. Script source equals, and we put the jQuery stuff in jQuery slash j, let's cheat. Click in there, Control A, Control C, paste that there, and then the closing script tag, and we're good. We'll save it, and just to make sure that it still goes fine, no problems. Yeah, I can get rid of this. Now we'll add Bootstrap in, just because Bootstrap makes it prettier. And that's really the biggest reason. So we have to go up to the head, and after the title, we do this link rel equals style sheet href equals, we put it in the Bootstrap, directory, and it's in CSS, and it's called bootstrap.min.css. The other part of Bootstrap comes down here after the jQuery script. Oops, that's the caps lock key, not tab. And it is another script tag. Source equals. And this one is bootstrap/js/bootstrap.min.js. And the closing script tag. We'll save that. Make sure it still loads nicely. It does. And I'm going to hit F12 to start up the developer tools. And in the console, I don't see any error messages, so that's good. Now, let's start putting the parts of our user interface in. So right here after the first body tag, I'll make this big now. I'm going to go over here, I'm going to make a div tag, and then I'm going to make the closing div tag, and everything about our user interface will be between those two. Inside of this div tag for Bootstrap, I'm going to put class equals container, and that'll make it look nicer. Now for the title of our entire page, I'll do an H1 and a closing H1, and inside of the H1, or heading level 1, I'll say JavaScript for ACI user interface. And that's it for the title. And now I know that this is kind of deprecated, but I just use it all the time. So, sorry. Alright, heading level 2. This is step 1 of our application usage flow. Select a fabric. H2. So there's the closing H2 tag. And for now, I'm just going to put another hard rule there. Okay, H2. Step 2. Enter credentials. H2. HR. Here's the next section. 3. This will be where we click on something to do, and this will take place after the user is logged in and the tokens have been received from the APIC and so on and so forth. So this one actually happened today. And finally, H2, section 4, output area, where whatever the user chooses to do in step 3, the output can go in this section here. HR. So we'll save that. We'll minimize it. Click and drag it on top of Chrome, and now this is what our user interface looks like so far. Hit F12, nothing in the console, so we're still good. Alright, what's next on our to-do list? We made the HTML file. Let's go ahead and start populating the little sections. So select a fabric. So inside of select a fabric, as I said, the easiest way that I've found to do that is to just give them a list and have them pick one. So I'm going to do that with a couple of radio buttons. And you can find out about these on Google. Just search for HTML radio buttons and it tells you how to make them. So here's how we do it. Input type equals radio. Here's the ID of this choice. Cisco Sandbox. Name of the entire radio button complex here is Fabric. And for this one, the value is the URL of the Cisco Sandbox, the public sandbox management interface, which is https://sandboxdc.cisco.com. And we'll just be fancy and make a label for it. Label for equals, and the ID is Cisco Sandbox. And we'll call this one, this will be the text that actually shows up beside the radio button, Cisco ACI Sandbox. APIC 1. Label. We'll do a line feed there. And even though we don't have another option for the user in our environment, I'm going to put one there so you can see that if you had multiple APICs like you do in an operational environment, you'd have at least 3. This is kind of how it would work. So it's a radio. This one would be another sandbox. Name equals Fabric because it's part of the same set of radio buttons. And the value, I'm just going to put another, well, let me change this. No word wrap. Another sandbox. It won't work. Cisco ACI Sandbox APIC X. No, there is such a thing as APIC X. I don't want to do that. So APIC, let's just call it another Cisco ACI Sandbox. And we'll put in here unused. Alright, so let's save that and look at it. Where's my mouse? File, save, make it small, click and drag this on to our, so there's our 2 options. The next part is the enter credentials part. So for that we'll just use some more HTML inputs. Here in section 2. So, and in this case the label usually comes before the input. For equals, and we're going to call this one username. And here's the text that will actually show up on the screen. Label. And here is the input. Type equals text. ID equals username, and this is how we'll identify this field, by that name. Placeholder, this will be the text that kind of shows up in the middle of the field to kind of give a hint to the user what they should type here. And the value we will initially set at nothing. Yes. Line feed. And label for equals password. And here's the text that will show up. Password. And here's the field for it. Input type equals password. That makes it so that when the user types in it, only stars show up. ID equals password. Very creative. Placeholder equals password in case they don't know what to type there. Value equals initially nothing. And another line feed. And then the user will need a button. And the ID for this button will be sign in button class, and this is where we'll use some bootstrap classes. btn primary, we'll make it blue. Here's the text that will show up on the button. Close the button tag, save it. Look at it. So now we have a place to choose fabric, and we have a place to put our username and our password, and there's a sign in button that doesn't do anything. So let's make it do something. Not much, but we'll make it do something. So down here, and next time we're going to split this out into its own file, and I'm going to make a bunch of returns, script, and the closing tag for our script. So I'm going to put some comments here, a bunch of stars, just to draw some attention to it. This stuff runs at load time. So what we want to do is find this button right here, and then tell it to do something when somebody clicks on it. So document.getElement by ID, sign in button, add event listener, click, and we're going to give it an anonymous function. And let's close that out so we don't forget to later. So when that button is clicked, here's what will be executed. Alert, you clicked on the sign in button. Save that. I'll drag this onto there. We can choose a fabric. We can enter a username and whatever password we want because it's not actually being used. And when we click on the sign in button, the alert comes up saying you clicked on the sign in button. So two things. One, if anybody knows an easier way to get this HTML file to start with the startup options that we set in our original shortcut without having to click on it and drag it to that, I would love to know. This is a series on JavaScript and ACI. I am not a Windows expert, so I would appreciate that if you would just put a comment or something saying how to do that. The other thing is that's as far as we're going to go today. And that's it for lesson 2. In the next lesson, we'll see if we can connect to an API using JavaScript. So see you then.